Hello, and welcome to Breaking the Silence, a podcast where we explore pressing social issues through the lens of justice, equity, and the profession of social work. I'm your host, Victoria Hawkins. Today, we're taking on a crisis that is both critical and often invisible. This is the epidemic of violence against Native American and Alaska Native women in the United States. Today, we'll be talking about the gravity of this epidemic, tracing the historical and systemic roots of this violence, exploring what's being done to address it, and connecting this crisis to one of the grand challenges for social work: build healthy relationships and violence. We'll also discuss the implications for social work practitioners and social work educators. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this conversation takes place on the Gulf Coast of Florida, on indigenous lands that were once inhabited by the Tocobaga and Calusa peoples. With this episode, I seek to honor the generations of Native people who have stewarded the lands of the Americas for generations and continue to do so. I honor their resilience and ongoing fight for justice, sovereignty, and the restoration of those lands. I also dedicate this episode to my Creek Indian ancestors and honor their teachings of strength, community, and commitment to the sacredness of earth and all of life. May I follow in those footsteps throughout my days. I'd also like to take a moment to say at this time that this topic is a sensitive one that we'll discuss today. Some of the information could be triggering to some, as I'm going to be discussing topics of violence towards individuals. So please be mindful of your own physical and emotional responses and take breaks if you need to along the way. I find for myself that if I'm becoming a bit dysregulated, taking 3 to 5 slow breaths and simply paying attention to my inhale and exhale with my hand lightly at the top of my chest centers and grounds me again. But if you find that listening is too much, you can alternatively connect with this information through our resource and reference list, and that will help you become more informed and find ways to take action. So let's start with the reality. Why do I call this a crisis? Native American and Alaska Native women in the United States experience violence at disproportionately higher rates than any other racial or ethnic group. Based on the 2020 US Census, there are over 9 million people who identify as American Indian and Alaska Native in the United States. That's about 3% of the population in the US. Yet, according to the National Institute of Justice, Native American and Alaska Native individuals are victims of violent crime at more than double the rates of all US residents. More than 84% of Native women experience at least one violent act in their lifetime. More than 56% will experience sexual violence. 56% will experience physical violence, and more than 48% experience stalking. Even more sobering is that 97% of the violent victimization is perpetrated by non-Native people against Native American and Alaska Native women. And finally, on tribal land and some reservations, the murder rates of Indigenous women are more than 10 times the national average in the United States. Now remember, I said 3% of the population identifies as American Indian or Alaska Native. And I didn't share this before, but currently there's 574 federally recognized Native tribal nations in the US, and the majority of the population lives in urban areas. About 13% live on reservations or tribal lands. So let's think about that last statistic again. On some reservations, the murder rates of these women and girls are more than 10 times the national average, and the majority of perpetrators are non-Native. And yet, despite these staggering numbers, this crisis remains largely invisible. Many cases are never investigated. Victims go missing and are never found, and families are left without justice or answers. And women who are Native American and Alaskan Native that are affected by violence, but not missing, they are also suffering and dealing with ongoing mental and emotional health challenges, physical injury, loss of homes at times, reduced socioeconomic capabilities due to this violence that they have incurred. Behind every one of these statistics is a person, a human being, a daughter, a mother, a sister, a community member. And these are women whose stories deserve to be told and whose lives deserve to be protected. So why are these women so often silenced or unheard? Part of this is structural and systemic. Tribal law enforcement often lacks the jurisdiction to prosecute non-Native offenders, even when crimes happen on tribal land. Federal agencies, which technically have the authority to prosecute the crimes, are often a great distance away from the locations of these crimes. They're underfunded and they're sometimes unresponsive. This leaves survivors in Native American communities trapped in a system where no one is taking responsibility. There's also cultural silencing. Generations of Indigenous people have been taught through colonization, historical oppression, violation of treaties made with them, forced removal from their lands, and displacement in boarding schools, that their voices don't matter. According to research that addresses the obstacles to seeking help after violent experiences, many Native American and Alaskan Native survivors fear speaking up because they know the system may not believe them or protect them. And beyond that, there is a broader societal silencing. The media rarely covers these cases. Data collection is poor. And when Native American and Alaskan Native women go missing, much of the media is quiet. Silence isn't just the absence of sound. It's also the result of a society that is looking the other way. So let's talk about the historical and structural roots. This violence is rooted in centuries of colonization and systemic oppression. Before European settlers' contact with the Americas, many Native tribal societies were matriarchal. So that means that women held power, they owned land, and they had a strong voice. But colonization imposed patriarchal systems, and this was done purposely to even break down the sense of community and disrupt the way that traditions and cultural resources were brought together. This began to erase some of the matriarchal traditions, and it also normalized violence against Indigenous women and broke up the current ways that roles amongst the tribal communities were shared. The forced removal of Native peoples, the trauma of boarding schools, and the suppression of Indigenous culture all fractured the traditional community structures that once protected women and families. After that came jurisdictional and legal constraints. So the US government restricted tribal sovereignty. And this happened by taking away tribal nations' authority to prosecute most crimes that were committed on their land by non-Native offenders, creating a legal loophole that effectively created a climate of non-accountability, where perpetrators could commit acts of violence without facing consequence. When we look at the current crisis through that historical lens, it becomes clear that this isn't just interpersonal violence. It's also societal and government-sanctioned violence. And this is created by the legacy of colonization, which is still operating here in the present day. Now let's bring in a social work perspective. So the Grand Challenges for Social Work identify 12 major goals that mobilize our profession to address the most urgent problems that we see are facing society. One of these challenges is build healthy relationships to end violence. Violence against Native American and Alaska Native women is overtly represented within this challenge. However, it also intersects with another grand challenge: eliminate racism. And this is because it isn't only about family or intimate partner violence, even though that is part of the statistics that we've heard. It's also about how Native American and Alaska Native women experience systemic and racialized violence that originated with the colonization of these lands and has ongoing impacts, creating this historical injustice. When a system denies justice to these women, policies fail to protect them, and red tape prevents accessing and using resources. Then, on top of it, their stories are silenced. That is all a representation of racism operating at a systemic level. As social workers, we have a commitment to human rights, cultural humility, and social justice. And because of that, we are uniquely positioned to lead change. But that requires moving beyond just individual interventions and towards systems level advocacy, community partnership, and that all of that is grounded in centering Indigenous voices, the voices of Native American and Alaska Native women and leaders. So now let's talk about what's being done. There is progress, but much remains to be done. Some of the progress is seen in the grassroots movements that have initiated the change. We see this in Native-led organizations that are fighting for an end to this violence and an increase in services. The Indian Law Resource Center, the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, and other local advocates are pushing for restoring lands and reestablishing tribal sovereignty. They're also working to strengthen tribal jurisdiction, improve data collection, and increase culturally grounded victim services. Additionally, the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, which I mentioned before, they offer things like toolkits and trainings and support for survivors of violence, and also information for non-Native individuals, which could be social workers and other providers, to become advocates and to be more culturally informed in how they work with these individuals that have survived violence. Then there's another organization called the Sovereign Bodies Institute, and they are working to collect data and honor missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit cases. And they also promote centering Indigenous-led research and action. Other ways that we see progress are through legislative efforts, such as the Savannahs Act and the Not Invisible Act. And these both target the critical issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. There's also policy amendments, such as the 2013 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. This began to address tribal nations' ability to prosecute violent perpetrators on tribal lands. In the social work field, practitioners and educators have been prompted in 2021 by the Council on Social Work Education and then the National Association of Social Workers to take accountability for the social work profession's role in historical oppression and trauma to the Native American peoples and communities. Now, this brought about the need to recognize and incorporate Indigenous perspectives, be more culturally informed with working with our Native Indigenous relations, to consider trauma-informed care, And also awareness and advocacy being worked into our daily practice as social workers, as well as our social work education curriculum. However, even with all of these legislative changes and progress in the field, most acts of violence against Native American and Alaska Native women go unprosecuted. Resources are still very limited due to lack of funds, rural environments, and an all-over lack of culturally appropriate care. So while we see that there are steps forward, true progress will only come when there is a greater emphasis on tribal sovereignty, cultural competence, especially among us as social workers, and true collaboration with Indigenous communities, where we are allowing and elevating the voices of Native leaders to be heard. Only then will Native American and Alaska Native women no longer be fighting alone. Instead, their voices will be leading the movement in a broader way, where they can be heard even more than in the grassroots movements that they have already begun and been successful in. Now, what are the implications then for social work practice and education? So what does this mean for us as social workers, for those of us in practice, education, and in advocacy roles? So for practitioners, we must recognize that violence against Native women is not only interpersonal, but it's also structural and systematic or systemic. There is also a need to support tribal sovereignty efforts to restore tribal nations' ability to govern and prosecute fully these violent crimes. There's a need to stand with Native leaders and policymakers to strengthen their voices and their message, following their lead. There's a need to spread awareness of legislation initiatives through keeping yourself informed and sharing Native and Indigenous created information. There's a need to join in on advocacy for increased resources and funding for culturally based survivor services. And also, there's a practical need for supporting Indigenous-led organizations, their social media campaigns that they've created, and advancing their initiatives. In addition, we can build relationships with Indigenous communities based on respect and partnership, not paternalism. Use trauma-informed, culturally grounded approaches that honor traditional healing practices, cultures, and spirituality. And advocate for policy reform, from funding tribal justice systems to improving cross-jurisdictional collaboration. But most importantly, that as practitioners, we center Native American and Alaskan Native voices in decision-making about services and interventions. Now, as social work educators, we can integrate Indigenous knowledge, history, and the understanding of resilience from an Indigenous perspective into our social work curriculum. We also can teach these historical roots to see how colonization and racism has shaped these social problems and this critical issue about violence against Native American and Alaska Native women. We can also create space for Indigenous scholars and community leaders to come and share in the classroom. Encourage research and field placements in partnership and collaboration with Native-led organizations. And most importantly, promote critical self-reflection so that future social workers understand their role not as being saviors, but as allies and advocates for sovereignty and justice. I believe that social work education truly has a power to shape generations of professionals and that we can see this as a central topic to our mission. Now, as we close, I'd like to return to the core of this episode, which is breaking the silence, giving voice. For too long, Native women have been silenced by systems that fail to protect them, and by a society that simply looks the other way. As social workers, truly as human beings, we have a responsibility to listen, to come alongside and elevate the voices of those who are advancing the movement for an end to this violence. We also have a duty to strengthen their voices through our own actions. So ending this violence means restoring tribal sovereignty, demanding accountability, engaging in culturally responsive service and care, and centering Indigenous leadership as we take action to advocate for the end of the crisis of violence against Native American and Alaska Native women. Thank you so much for listening today. If you'd like to learn more or take action, there are two great places to start. You can visit the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center at niwrc.org. And you can also explore the Grand Challenges for Social Work initiative at grandchallengesforsocialwork.org. Additionally, you can find more resources and articles in the accompanying reference page to this episode. Let's continue the conversation, and let's ensure that Native American and Alaskan Native women are silent no more. Thank you.